Good to be here. Always good to be here. On this episode of Matt's Art Chat, I talk with Bret Louis Adams. He's a painter, a photographer, an artist, a creative soul. Currently based in Lisbon. But we have been talking since last year when he was based in Prague. And we'd been discussing, much like Lucas Hay, the possibility of filming him at a studio there. But obviously, since he's moved to a new city, we're not going to be able to do that. So instead, I thought about documenting a conversation with him. And here it is. This is a conversation about the arts and his formative years and his inspiration. And we also mention a lot of names of great artists all throughout. In fact, I'm dedicating this podcast to all of the art fanatics around the world. And so it was a really great conversation, and I was so delighted to chat with him. And I leave you to it. Thanks very much for watching. Enjoy.
Hello, Matt.
Oh man, it's great to hear you. Just a little bit of a backstory. I contacted you last year in the hopes of maybe being able to film you at your studio in Prague at the time, and we weren't able to make that happen. But and now I hear that you have moved from Prague to a different city, right?
That's right. I've recently moved to Lisbon. Well, recently, it's almost been half a year.
You're a bit of a globetrotter, let's say.
I suppose.
Where are you originally from, Bret?
I grew up in Texas. My quick answer is always Austin because I most culturally associate myself with the capital. But the truth is I grew up in the suburbs of Houston.
Oh, but you come from the suburbs, let's say. So what's the difference between the city center and like the suburbs or setting like a suburbs of Houston?
Well, that's the funny thing about American city and urban designs. They tend to focus on these small sort of community villages, suburbs, right? And the city centers are sort of a focus on commerce. So they don't have this old town center. So people don't really live in the city center per se. They kind of are constantly spread out into these very highly organized and very cyclically patterned suburbs. They're very similar. They have the home improvement store, the Starbucks, and the same grocery store every 5 miles, and it seems like they draw the street names out of a hat, so it's like Pine Brook Knoll Way or something like that. So for me, it was this sort of nauseating sort of repetition to live in these sorts of places. So I guess it's a small area, but really it's like exactly the same as the areas around it. I don't know. It's so different from the architecture of European cities.
So you wouldn't consider the place where you grew up particularly artistic?
No, it was very conservative. People, take pretty, practical studies. They settle down, have a family, buy a house, do the sort of standard thing. And that's how the cities are oriented, that you're able to buy a house, that everything is really large and spread out. Houston is about, land-wise, about as big as London, I think. And the resources are allocated to that, streets, houses, grid development. And yeah, it's kind of like the opposite of creative. It's sort of like hyper, practical, I suppose.
Hyper practical, right. And but so within this landscape, how do you sort of blossom in your formative years and realize that you have artistic ambitions of your own?
I suppose it was sort of a lack of blossoming, really. I grew up in this area that was very traditional, culturally conservative. And even though I went to a school that was located really close to NASA, a lot of NASA kids went to my school, I was exposed to this international community. I never realized that I was in this Texas bubble until I decided to move and study arts in the capital. I visited once and I was just sold. It was so different and it was so much a more accessible, smaller city. I think it's about 1.5 million. And it just has a much more beautiful character. It had well, a really nice vibe, to be frank. And the suburbs, really, you could go from one side of Houston, drive an hour to the other, and you'll find an extremely similar urban design for another suburb with a really similar name. It was really disheartening. And that, and plus my parents encouraged me in the arts. They both were artists and did a sort of design study in college, if I can recall correctly, and they're both musicians. So it was always there, but they raised me to be practical. They said, well, but do what you love. So I said, well, I would love to get out of the suburbs before I wilt.
Yeah, right. Well, it's good to hear that, because having support from your family is something that I feel is very necessary when you embark on a journey as travailed as that to like a career in the arts, right?
Mm-hmm.
And yeah, that's interesting, because I've come across your works as a painter, but just speaking about your formative years, was this always your primary mode of expressing yourself through the arts, or maybe did you start by maybe trying something else, like learning how to play an instrument, or do you play an instrument?
Oh, I'm sort of a beginner level. I understand the basics of music theory. I can very slowly read sheet music, and I learned some bossa nova chords. But it never really grabbed me. I never had the attention span for it, whereas I can find myself hyper-focusing on my artwork. So maybe it's something about the way the physical medium unfolds, and you're just manipulating it there. Whereas I think music is perhaps much more open to interpretation. I mean, you can like jam and mess around and do these sort of repetitive exercises, whereas you paint, you make the painting and it's done, you move on. There's the repetitive techniques that you practice, but for me, it was something satisfying about the physical nature of it. But to be honest, I actually focused mostly on sculpture in high school, right, secondary school. And then in college, I was doing general studies. And from there, I wasn't sure what to do. I took some time to work and save money, and then I came back to painting because of its practicality. It's easy to store, it's a two-dimensional medium, as well as drawing, and I just decided that would be my focus, so I went from there.
Now, it's interesting that you would say, actually, that you know some basic chords of bossa nova. Is there any reason in particular why you learned how to play the bossa nova? Because it is, for those who don't know, a specific type of music from Brazil, and I associate it with a type of nostalgic romanticism.
It does have some kind of strange sort of romantic allure that's unavoidable. It's I suppose it's also nostalgic, not just because it's from the 60s and 70s, when it became most popular, but there's something about the quality of it. I can't remember what really grabbed me about it. I think it's just the specific texture of the style. And when I was watching people play it, it was in a really different than just strumming chords back and forth. And they use a plastic string guitar, nylon string guitar, instead of a steel string. And the chords, you kind of pluck them out with your fingers. And I thought it was interesting how they have these really odd rhythms. The chords are all super strange. There's no they very rarely use C major. It's always like B flat diminished 7 plus 9 mixed in with like C sharp 6/9. They're basically this brilliant jazz musician, and his name is Antonio Carlos Jobim, right? Was this brilliant jazz musician and basically developed these chords on his own. And with his knowledge of music theory, was able to work these really strange sounds together in a way that I don't know how he would come up with it. It's so strange and exotic, but soothing and simple at the same time.
Yeah, I'm a big fan of bossa nova. That's why I thought to ask you. I was very sad when João Gilberto passed away last year.
It was last year. Yeah, it was quite recent.
Yeah, I know. And now you're in the land of the fado.
Yeah, the fado. Yeah.
Right. So, I mean, there is some sort of a musical awareness that you have. Do you feel like it sort of influences your work as a painter?
Hard to say. Let's see. Perhaps the quality of the music or the feeling or the general mood might be more influencing. Lately, I've been interested in contemporary classical music, which is kind of an oxymoron. But the most obvious example to cite is Philip Glass. He has this sort of strange organization of patterns, mechanical. And I kind of like this sort of sense of repetition, the way he builds his music. And maybe subconsciously it sort of filters in, influences my work. But I'd say I'd say most of my work would be influenced from Impressionism and post-impressionism, basically, and all the other styles that evolved from that before abstraction really took hold.
Got you. Yeah, you mentioned the big word there, impressionism, and I noticed that a lot of your paintings seem to be definitely following that sort of art movement or style. Is there a reason for that? Stylistically, obviously, impressionism. The most famous artist, possibly painter, in fact, that people know, even non-art aficionados or anybody who doesn't know anything about art, definitely knows Van Gogh or Van Gogh, or it's pronounced
Yeah,
in
I'm not
different
Dutch.
ways.
It's from Van Gogh.
But yeah,
Yeah,
so that's the
obviously.
kind of style that you is closest to the way in which you paint, or you would define yourself as an impressionist.
Exactly. And I think he falls right on the line of post-impressionism, where people started to take impressionism and add their own stylistic devices. As you can see, he's obviously an impressionist painter. Everyone knows this. But there's something quite different about the quality of his work. A strange movements, small line strokes that are made extremely obvious, this sort of brilliant use of bright colors, and his compositions were just outstanding. It's not just the sort of physical qualities you can talk about. There's something really immaterial that really strikes me, and I've always tried I guess to use a modern phrase, to like get that Van Gogh vibe going. And it's really hard to describe what you see in an artist's work that you like. I'm sure I borrow from lots of other artists, and it's the same way with music. You sort of get this sort of feeling. You want to reproduce not just the chords, but the sort of tone, the sensation of the music. And that's the whole thing, I think, with finding your voice as an artist, is seeing what feels like correct, despite all the technical influences.
I was going to actually ask you, everyone has their different interpretations of almost everything that exists on this planet of ours and beyond. But if you were to sort of give your own definition of Impressionism to perhaps someone who is not familiar with the movement at all, what would you say, and what would be your personal interpretation of Impressionism?
The title gives it away. It's an impression of a scene or an object. It's not just the physical representation. As we could see, photography started to make hyperrealism obsolete, or at least for a time, painters felt that way. For an easy example is obviously Picasso. He tried to intellectualize the medium even further than just the aesthetic value. So we see people like Van Gogh trying to give a much more sort of, I suppose you could say, let's see, what's the word I'm looking for? A sense of nostalgia, or some kind of immersion into the way that the painting could make you feel, or at least, if I may say, the mind's eye, the way the mind sees the painting or sees the scene in there, and how it translates into a sort of a general feeling, an ambiance, an impression of how the actual setting or object may give to the viewer. So it's not just the subject, but to try and imbue it with some special immaterial poetic quality, to know how the scene should invoke you to feel, not just the scene itself.
Right. Before we actually get into the specifics of your works, and perhaps even the way in which you work, I wanted to know more about your personal journey. We mentioned, you mentioned your Texas upbringing, let's say, and that you grew up there. But at what point do you decide to move out?
Well, I had a unique opportunity to move to Prague. I fell in love with a girl who really supported me as an artist. I met so many people, so many artists who had finished school and felt completely exhausted from the art world. They felt disillusioned, that they worked hard on these projects that weren't really leading them to the next step as artists. In the end, I mean, perhaps their work evolved, but they weren't sure how to progress it into more of a career, or at least make it something that they wish to pursue. Whereas feeling discouraged, I met someone who was saying, "Hey, let's do this." She was going to go study in Prague for theater, to do a master's in devised theater, and she was really paramount in supporting me, I suppose, as you could say, not financially or anything, but emotionally as an artist, encouraging in a way. And when she was accepted to a school in Prague, after we had toured Europe, we did an artist residency in Budapest, and I did my TEFL certification in Prague with the expectation to try and move back to Europe. And once she was accepted, it was an easy transition to move there with a partner. So once I'd established myself there, I realized that I needed to grow much more than just from a part of Texas, but into sort of a much bigger scope. I suppose you could say world traveler, but more of like an artist.
Are you still together with this girl?
No, like this.
No.
She ended up staying in Prague, and I had a sort of a sudden burst of energy to move to Lisbon. I planned a trip here and decided to apply for some jobs. And when they all accepted me, I put a down payment on an apartment and sort of went with the wind.
Very often it's also love that drives us to different places. Somehow, while you were telling me that story, I was reminded of this underground filmmaker called Nick Zed. I don't know if you're familiar with him.
No.
Well, he was from the States, and I believe, I know he now lives in New Mexico, but I'm not entirely sure that he's originally from there. And he had started this cinematic movement called Cinema of Transgression. And he was friends with a lot of great artists there who were part of the no-wave filmmaking period. And at some point, he moved to London to reach his then girlfriend, Lydia Lunch, who's a very familiar person to a lot of people who were involved in the punk movement and no-wave scene at the time. And when he got there, the girl actually broke up with him. And so he was feeling this deep sadness, but made a movie about it where he just shot scenes of her in London while she narrated the scenes with a breakup letter for him that had been recorded on a tape. So I don't know why I thought of that, but it's interesting how love moves us sometimes, don't you think?
Yeah, I definitely think that heartbreak, romance, and general passions and throngs of life can lead us artistically in a lot of directions. I feel like there's a lot of stories behind artists, their paintings, whether they're with their wives or their close friends or strangers that become acquainted with, that influences their work greatly. I mean, you take for granted how many famous painters Vincent van Gogh spent time with, or the strange and somewhat sadistic relationship Picasso had with his various girlfriends or mistresses, or perhaps even someone as humble as Henri Matisse and his wife, and how she encouraged him and was his rock and by his side all out throughout his life.
Yeah, exactly. Yeah, that's very fascinating. You know, we have a common friend, Lucien Zell.
Oh, yeah.
And he says, he often says this thing, the heart breaks to get bigger. So I think there's a lot of truth in what he says.
Yeah, he's a fine poet, isn't he? I haven't seen him in quite a while. It'd be nice to catch up with him.
It drives me crazy how he's, he hasn't been, I feel like he hasn't been discovered. But that's another thing that artists struggle with, is being discovered. I don't know. There's a lot of frustration. I feel a lot of frustration when I think about that.
Yeah, I think that's one of the most difficult things for artists, is the intense subjectivity of their work, their audience, their importance, their perspective, and generally their sort of idea of success. I've been studying a Portuguese poet named Fernando Pessoa, who was very accomplished at an early age in writing, and he always expected to gain some success, but never quite attained it. Somehow he seemed to correctly predict that he would gain some fame after his death, and now he's regarded as one of the most important modern poets of Portuguese language. But it's the whole idea of being discovered it can really kind of damage an artist. They say that you must make art for art's sake, but really it's art for the artist's sake. That's a quote from Pessoa. For your own sake, to feel that you are being yourself and playing your role without feeling like you're playing the role for someone else. I mean, there's sort of a purity in making work just because you have the ability to, and then I suppose there's making deadlines and commissions and things like that. But overall, yeah, it can be a real struggle, feeling like you never find your place. It can be difficult.
You know, it's interesting when you bring up Fernando Pessoa, because I always think about the fact that he, during his lifetime, only published 4 books. Lots of other writers as well shared similar fates. I think of Kafka as well. I mean, he was a troubled soul. Do you feel that the artist also must remain detached from society in order to capture an essence of it in a very personal way, or just capture its essence in a distant way?
Yeah, you do see that, and I find a lot of artists who are really immersed in their work detached, but it might be sort of a symptom of being hyper focused on their work. Whereas, for example, I was watching this short documentary on the painter Claude Monet's general eating habits. He was really fond of food. He's quite a big guy, and he just muddled in obscurity for a while until finally he gained name. And once he gained some success, he would wake up, make a huge breakfast, paint all day with his various children as well. He would decorate his garden. He would have a huge lunch, invite a bunch of friends. Basically, he just had a grand old time close to the end of his life. It sounds quite lovely. And so you get this idea of this like sad, lonely artist, starving on the seashore, painting away. But really, a lot of these people were socialites in a way. I know Picasso tried to mix with as many circles as he can. He was very ambitious, not only in his work, but in who he knew and the kind of shows he tried to participate in. And just in the same way, Francis Bacon, for example, was very socially active, known for going about and drinking late with his friends. He was very well known for being kind of a party animal. So I think Andy Warhol might be my last citation for this concept. He was definitely very removed as a person from his work, from the society in a way. He was sort of isolated himself with these alternative culture types, but he had his factory. He had his big sort of workshop where he made these works. He had all these crazy people coming over at all hours, and but at the same time, they say he was always sort of aloof and removed. He made his work as if he was from a totally different plane of existence or something. And all of his work is sort of this cold commentary on art world consumerism and commercialism. So in a way, he was right in the middle of the culture in so many respects, but in another way, he was very cold and removed. His work is very sort of impersonal, but it's how he relays his message in a way. So it all kind of comes together. It's not just the work, but the artist and his influence and his basically his way of living, his lifestyle are all keys to the message that they're trying to send.
I gotta tell you, Bret, I'm loving all the names that we're throwing out there. This is definitely an arts, aficionados podcast that we're doing together.
All right.
I love it. But what
Great.
you said about Monet and then all of the other artists that you mentioned as well prompts me to ask you a question. Would you say that you have a similar routine or something that facilitates your artwork, or any habits that you'd like to share?
Yeah, I think it's a great question for artists. And the problem with me is I have such a distractible mind that it seems like I am absolutely, averse to patterns or schedules or routines. Sometimes things just strike me and I'll finish a couple of works and do some drawings and go to a workshop in one day and then not produce anything for several days. It's quite strange. I've always been trying to see how I can channel myself, but I really just surprise myself sometimes. So I wish I could be in that realm where I knew this is my routine, this is my ritual that I begin my work, but I'm still trying to discover it about myself. I'm not sure if it's a weakness that I lack this sort of discipline, or if it's a strength that I can just put a body of work forward at some random time, and I just need to sort of accept that this is the way I am.
Well, perhaps that chaos is part of your inspiration.
Perhaps so. Perhaps
wouldn't-
if the less I think about it, the more I just sort of do it without thinking. I feel like overthinking can definitely be a hurdle. Preparing the work, considering the content, its impact. If I'm going to do another series, all this overthinking, it becomes a bit stifling.
What's life like in Lisbon now? You've been there for a year. Why did you? Was there something in particular that you liked about that city, the energy or anything like that?
Yeah, to quote myself again, it just had a great vibe, and I just sort of went with it. I've been here, well, actually a half year now, and I found the sort of warmth and energy in the air to be invigorating. You're by the ocean. You can see the ocean very easily. There's these very steep hills that you constantly honestly, the whole city is uphill. There's no downhill. You always have this fantastic views that just pop out of nowhere. And while in Prague, it was cold most of the year. The city seems much more like a fortress. It's very stony and hard. And there's something about the culture and the life that's reflected in the food, even, for example, the sort of roasted pork and beer. Whereas when I came here, it was really nice to switch to good wine and fried fish. So there's definitely really a big difference in the sort of overall attitude of the people, the foreign or locals, the culture of the city, and the sort of vivaciousness of the street life. With the warm weather, people are just constantly going around. I mean, I just came back from visiting Prague recently, and it was at about 2 degrees when I left, and the next week when I arrived in Lisbon, it was about 21 degrees during the day, so it's easy to constantly go out, and you feel that sort of energy in the air.
I feel the same way because, I was born in Italy and raised in Ireland. So right now I'm in Ireland and I spend a lot of time in Italy. And so whenever I I go from one place to the other, I definitely feel the change in the difference in temperature. But at the same time, I lived in Prague for 2 years, so I know what you're talking about. There is a stony feeling to the place. I found it very interesting, but the reason why I keep moving is also because I need to keep finding different energies. And I feel like you can relate to that.
Oh, an energy collector, huh? I like that idea. I'm not sure exactly if I would want to move to another city soon. I'd quite like the idea of finding a city to settle down in. I know a lot of people have this romantic idea of being nomads and going from city to city, but I can't help but feel that perhaps a bit fated. What I would do in Prague was I was sort of had this premonition that I wouldn't stay there forever, although I kind of accepted the idea that I might be there somewhat permanently. And I asked a lot of friends or acquaintances if they had recommended I would ask them if they could live in another city, where would they go? And many of them said Lisbon, so I planned a holiday here. But by the time that came around, came to pass that I was going to fly here, my relationship had ended, and it was the start of the new school year. It was in late July. And I realized that during my trip, it was the best time to find work. And it just so happened I applied to 3 teaching agencies, and they all accepted me and gave me a schedule right away. And I ended up finding a nice apartment, and my flatmate happened to be a visa lawyer, so that was also a plus. And I just took these all as good signs. And since I've moved here, things have gone along quite well.
But if there was a place where you would like to go and perhaps fantasize about moving to, is there a place in your mind, or are you quite content where you are right now?
I suppose I am content here. Perhaps I'm spoiled by the Western European culture. By Western, I also include the Czech Republic. A lot of my friends said they had spent time in, teaching English in Vietnam or in South America, but I don't know. There's something about Europe I quite liked. I enjoyed all of the other cities I'd visited. I'd spent time in Barcelona. Of course, I've visited Rome and Paris and London and Copenhagen and Amsterdam. These cities had a lot of appeal, but there's something about the livability, the sort of balance. Lisbon was it's kind of quaint. It's small and accessible. It's not overpriced. It's not overly hyper sanitized. I always tell people it's very tattooed. There's tons of street graffiti, and they don't really seem to bother cleaning it up that much. And it's good. There's sort of this open environment of people that just, I don't know, that don't want to bother each other. Whereas I've been to some places that they just sort of, I don't know, either the city was too big or it was too small, or the culture was too intense, or the culture was too cold. And I feel like I found kind of a Goldilocks zone here. So if I find some place that invites me there to live and the stars align, then I'll definitely try and take that magic carpet again. But we'll see until then.
It sounds like my kind of place, Lisbon does, but I've been to numerous places around the world, and can you believe it? I have never been to Lisbon or Portugal, despite the fact that I absolutely love the musicality of the Portuguese language, among other things.
Yeah, it's kind of a cute language, yeah, especially the Brazilian accent, if I may say, against the Portuguese.
Big time.
I really, really love it. It's so cute, or at least in the song, and even their accents here, you can hear the difference between the Brazilians. They're more open. They speak more clearly and slowly, and and it's charming.
Yeah, another thing that I think I love about that particular accent is that I was born in a city called Genoa in Italy, and the dialect there sounds a lot like Portuguese. There's a lot of Portuguese influence. I don't know who influenced who, but it just the sonicality of it really appeals to me. And yes, I hope to go there soon. But I know that Carnival is going on there. And did you get a chance to check out the scene, the Carnival scene?
Oh yeah, I saw a little action. Sure, they had in the oldest part of the old town. They had a small parade, and they had some others in the sort of outlying villages or small cities and small towns. But I just kind of checked out the festivities from afar and watched parts of the parade. But yeah, I got a piece of it. It was nice. Yeah. It's nothing like Rio de Janeiro, though.
Oh, well, yeah, see, that's another place that I would love to go to. Brazil is number one country that I would absolutely love to go to at this moment in time anyways. But I think since I was a child, because I was a big fan of this Disney movie called The Three Caballeros. And, wow, Bahia. That's the place where I would love to go the most. Anyways.
Oh yeah, I've actually been there. I went to Salvador for a little period. It was quite nice. I enjoyed it. Yeah.
Amazing. Hey, so I'm an impressionist such as yourself. I hope I can. This is a definition that I just came up with, but I don't know if you would define yourself as an impressionist as such. But nonetheless, yeah.
Oh, I was just going to comment about the whole idea of isms seems to be kind of falling off, or at least out of style. People would define these art critics in the past would define these people with this like a certain phrase, and like it looks as if this painting is made of little cubes. Thus, we have cubism. I see only the impression of an image. Thus, impressionism, as these critics would say. And now, art is just a smorgasbord of insanity. I mean, you can do anything now. Right. So to ascribe to an ism it's almost like it's almost saying that you're like
restricting yourself.
Perhaps restricting, but just sort of using an archaic term. Like imagine saying you support the Austro-Hungarian Catholic Empire. It just doesn't make sense. It doesn't exist anymore. And to support this sort of like institution of impressionism is almost like to subscribe to something that's kind of extinct. So you'd see impressionism, but you're also influenced by the internet age, digital art, digital mediums, and all the art that came in before that, and all the artists around you. But yeah, to simplify, obviously, I would like to think of myself as an impressionist painter.
Yeah, I mean, one of the things about impressionism that I think about is just the feeling. I think you mentioned it as well in your definition, is the essence of the moment, capturing something that happens in the moment. And I'm not surprised that you are not just a painter but also a photographer, which is really interesting to me because in a way you can achieve a lot. There's a lot of difference between the two things, but when I think about the style in which you paint, they sort of it makes sense that you would be involved in the two. I don't know how to say it any better, but it makes sense that you would be involved both in painting and photography. It's odd that I mean, as an artist, even if you don't work in a medium, for example, let's say I had no exposure to music, it's quite common that I would have some appreciation for it. But it's funny, I don't feel like a photographer, yet I take more photos than I do any other type of work. I take roughly 10 photos a day on average or something. I think I have actually, let's have a look here. Let's see how many photos I have just for the year 2019 pictures. See, we have 2018. There's 27 items here. I have, for the year 2018, 32,974 photos, 69 gigabytes of photos and videos. It's a huge body, and yeah, I love photography, especially on my iPhone. There's something about capturing the immateriality of the moment quickly on a small camera. I can just like take it out and like snap it, and maybe for a composition study, or just to feel nostalgic, or just to remember what I was doing in that day, from a few years in the future. There's definitely something captivating about capturing these photos. In other words, there is something that drives you to being both involved in painting and photography. I mean, you can achieve different things via these different forms.
Yeah, and I think people take for granted how the spontaneity of a photograph. Most photographs, quality photographs, are usually somewhat planned. A good camera, a specific setting, landscapes or a portrait. But to be able to have a small camera constantly ready and just snap that moment, no matter how insignificant or banal, there's something that becomes that you achieve in bringing something like that into a lens. And it gives that moment a different texture than having your friends line up and take a photo, or taking some scenic tourist photos, for example.
Yeah, big time. Yeah, one of the things that I hate is when people ask you to pose for a photograph, and I'm like, well, this is not how people like to remember things. They like to remember things actively and just spontaneous. And it's always great when a friend of yours just takes pictures when you don't even know it, because then you look back on it and you actually feel as if you are there as you're watching the photograph. I mean, there's definitely a big difference.
Yeah, I definitely do that. I take quick, natural shots before people start to try to act naturally. It's sort of an oxymoron sort of phrase, to act naturally.
Prompts me to think as well that perhaps our memories are shaped by the way in which photographs of us were taken.
Oh yeah, that's exactly. In fact, it's not just that our memories preserve the past or a detailed photo, but the timing of the photo, or perhaps, for example, a song you could have written, or a song that you might have studied, or a painting you did at the time, maybe of a subject or maybe of some moment. They all have a sort of a special way to capture that time, not just the memory, but to capture the time, the essence, and sort of emote a sort of nostalgia or longing or yearning or some other kind of immaterial emotion that we don't quite have a word for.
Now, when you think back on your body of work, let's say, that you have done so far, would you be able to identify perhaps a driving theme within it?
Let's see. It's quite difficult. At first, it was landscapes, because I enjoy to draw or paint them, and eventually I felt like I wanted to find more personal objects. In Prague, I felt sort of overwhelmed by this new environment, but I found I've always had a sort of obsession with tchotchkes. I find little pieces of junk to collect. And when I was searching for a general study to practice, I was at my first studio, and I think I first painted a small alarm clock, like wind-up clock. But it wasn't just the fact that it was some random clock, but that I researched it. It was a clock made by a brand called Prim in what was then Czechoslovakia. And it was the only brand of clock and watchmaker in Czechoslovakia at that time. So it was like a brand that doesn't exist. So it's sort of a secret piece of nostalgia injected into the painting. Not only do I capture this small, simple object that I carry with me, which is in fact personal, but not only does it have no real material value, but it also is very deeply connected to the location and the history of Prague, or the Czech Republic, mixed with Slovakia. And the other subject, I think I next painted a cactus that I found that was dying in my old studio. The environment was too cold and it was underwater, and I ended up taking care of it, and I painted that, and I did a series of cacti that eventually my former partner used in some of her performances as just like some simple props. So again, these pieces became sort of tied to the environment at a specific time. Whereas most people see some simple little cactus, to me it was something I remember in a specific way, just like the other objects I painted later.
All right, so we have actually, believe it or not, been talking for almost 40 minutes. But it's been a good conversation, and I'm happy to keep going for a couple of minutes if you're all right
Sure.
with that. And I wanted to ask you, is there anything in particular that you're working on at the moment that's taking up a lot of your time and a lot of attention?
Yes, in fact, I did a series. I'm doing a series on Fernando Pessoa. Partially out of my own interest, I wanted to do a quick painting in black and white, just to be able to execute something, because I hadn't been working as much, and pique the interest of my boss. So, in the interest of my financial gain, I decided to do a whole series. So hopefully that'll work out, because my one of my agency bosses was very interested in Portuguese writers and really took quite nicely to this idea of me doing a series. So hopefully She will be my benefactor, and that I will display my works at her teaching agency, at her school. So I was focusing on that. I have been focusing on that. But the next subject I want to work on is paintings of street graffiti, something that also is not only tied to the location and places that I visit, but something that's sort of ephemeral, which may or may not be painted up or covered by more graffiti anytime in an unpredictable fashion. So there's something fleeting about capturing this moment that sort of not only goes into the stylistic approach of Impressionism, but the idea of capturing a fleeting moment, whatever way that may be.
Do you you mentioned the interest in graffiti, I think, earlier while talking about Lisbon. Do you have any tattoos?
It's funny. I never found something that I felt I would want to get tattooed. I don't know if it was the squeamishness of it or just that I never felt like I was a tattoo person. I've always been sort of on the fringe of the alternative culture, counterculture, but just by the fact of being a sort of a usual eccentric person. I was always told I was so weird as a child, so I took it to mean that I was part of this other culture, but I never felt really especially part of that other culture, except not merely by default. So there's some kind of sort of otherness to my fascination with tattoos and street artists. I feel like street artists often have tattoos, if that might be a cliche. And there's something about that sort of countercultural impersonality of, and perhaps the purity of saying that I don't need a fancy piece of art on a canvas or some expensive sculpture, that there's something also fleeting about not only making, if something as simple as, painting your name or your tag on the side of a random wall, but also to have some kind of image on your skin that has also some kind of specific significance. It's not just about the aesthetic quality of the image, it's about why you got it, where you got it, and what you were doing, and who you were at that time. So there's definitely this sort of a momentum of this sort of temporality that has always fascinated me, and I feel like that's a good subject to pursue for me.
Bret, it's been fascinating talking with you. I really appreciated you taking the time to talk, and thanks again, and we should do this again sometime.
Yeah, and I look forward for you to visit me in Lisbon.
Oh man, hopefully it'll be sooner than later.
All right, man. All right, it's been great for you to talk to you. Thanks for reaching out.
Thanks a lot.